Mr. Hoan has gone missing. The man who once stood between love and freedom has vanished without a trace. But instead of relief, a heavy silence falls over Tu Diep and James. Is this disappearance the key to their happiness, or the beginning of a deeper unease? As unanswered questions linger in the air, they are forced to face a painful truth. Some absences don't bring peace, they bring consequences.
No one noticed it at first. Life rarely announces the moment it changes forever. It was only when the phone kept ringing into silence, when the familiar footsteps never crossed the old wooden floor again, that the truth slowly settled in. Mr. Hoan was gone. The morning air felt heavier than usual. Tu Diep stood by the window, watching the street where people passed as they always did, carrying baskets, worries, and ordinary hopes. Everything looked the same, yet something invisible had shifted. Absence, she realized, could be louder than anger. It pressed against her chest like an unanswered question. James heard the news not through words, but through stillness. His father's room remained untouched. The chair where Mr. Hoan used to sit, stern, silent, controlling, stood empty. For years, that presence had been a shadow over his choices, his love, his future. And now, without warning, the shadow had vanished. Neighbors whispered. Some said Mr. Hoan had left on his own. Others hinted at shame, regret, or unfinished business pulling him away. Each rumor carried curiosity, but no certainty. What remained was a strange quiet, the kind that forces people to listen to their own thoughts. James felt torn. A part of him breathed easier, like someone finally loosening a tight knot around his ribs. No more confrontations, no more orders disguised as love, no more walls between him and Tu Diep. And yet, beneath that relief, a deeper ache stirred. How could freedom feel so heavy? How could silence hurt more than shouting? Tu Diep noticed the change in James immediately. His smiles came and went like fragile light, flickering, unsure whether to stay. She wanted to ask him if he felt happier now, but the question itself felt cruel. Happiness built on disappearance felt unstable, like a house standing on sand. At dinner, they spoke softly, about small things, about the weather turning colder, about work, about tomorrow. But between every sentence, Mr. Hoan's absence sat quietly with them, uninvited, yet impossible to ignore. As night fell, Tu Diep wondered if peace truly begins when conflict ends, or if it begins only when hearts learn how to forgive, even without closure. James lay awake, staring into the dark, realizing that his father's disappearance had not erased the past. It had only opened a door to emotions he had long avoided. And so the question lingered, unanswered in the quiet room. If the man who caused so much pain is gone, why does happiness still feel so far away?
Freedom arrived without celebration. It slipped into the house like a quiet guest, leaving its shoes by the door and sitting down without asking. James felt it in the mornings most clearly. No sharp voice calling his name, no cold expectations weighing on his shoulders. The air was lighter, yet his steps felt uncertain, as if he had forgotten how to walk without being pushed. Tu Diep watched him closely. She had imagined this moment many times before. Mr. Hoan gone, the walls between her and James finally broken, love free to breathe. But reality was more complicated than dreams. James laughed more easily now, yet his eyes carried a question he never spoke aloud. Life around them continued its ordinary rhythm. The market opened at dawn, motorbikes rushed past, neighbors argued and reconciled as they always had. People smiled, lived, moved on. Only in the quiet moments did the truth surface. Happiness does not simply appear when an obstacle disappears. One afternoon, as Tu Diep washed vegetables by the small sink, she asked softly, Do you feel relieved?" James paused. The word lingered between them like fragile glass. Relieved. Yes. Guilty. Also yes. He nodded, then shook his head, unsure which feeling deserved to speak first. "I thought I would feel free," he said at last, "but freedom shouldn't feel like this."
That night, memories returned uninvited. His father's harsh lessons, his rigid rules, the unspoken fear beneath every command. Mr. Hoan had been wrong, James knew that. Yet the man was still his father. Disappearance did not erase blood, nor did it silence the voice of conscience. Tu Diep felt her own conflict growing. She loved James deeply, and part of her whispered that this was their chance. No more battles, no more approval to beg for. But another part of her wondered whether love built on someone else's absence could ever feel whole. She reached for James's hand as they sat on the steps outside, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. "Maybe happiness doesn't come all at once," she said gently. "Maybe it comes in pieces." James squeezed her hand, grateful for her patience. He realized then that true freedom was not the absence of his father, but the courage to face what remained, his memories, his guilt, his responsibility to choose differently. As the night deepened, the world around them seemed calm, almost ordinary. Yet inside both their hearts, a quiet struggle continued. Mr. Hoan's disappearance had opened a door, but what lay beyond it was not simple joy. It was a path of understanding, forgiveness, and growth. And somewhere in that uncertain space, James and Tu Diep began to understand. Freedom without healing is only another kind of cage.
Silence can be kind, but it can also be cruel. After Mr. Hoan disappeared, the silence he left behind began to grow heavier with each passing day, pressing itself into the corners of James's life. At first, it felt like peace. Then, slowly, it turned into something else, an unanswered question that refused to sleep. The phone never rang with his father's voice, yet James found himself staring at the screen, half expecting a call that would never come. In the mornings, as he tied his shoes or sipped his coffee, small habits betrayed him. He still listened for footsteps. He still braced himself for criticism. Trauma, he learned, does not vanish simply because the source is gone. Tu Diep noticed the change before James did. His smiles came later now. His thoughts wandered further. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, she accidentally dropped a bowl. The sharp sound shattered the calm, and James flinched. It was brief, almost invisible, but she saw it. Her heart tightened. "You're still living with him," she said gently, not as an accusation, but as a truth spoken aloud. James exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath for years. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted. "I waited so long for him to disappear from my life. Now that he has, I don't know who I am without that fight." Outside their home, life continued in familiar patterns. Children argued over homework, couples quarreled about money, parents scolded, loved, controlled, sometimes all at once. Tu Diep realized that many families lived this way, carrying invisible wounds beneath ordinary routines. Their story was not rare, it was painfully human.
Rumors about Mr. Hoan began to circulate. Some said he had left the country. Others whispered of illness or debt or shame. Each rumor added another layer of uncertainty. James listened, said nothing, and felt everything. Part of him feared the truth. Another part feared never knowing it. One night, unable to sleep, James stepped outside alone. The street was quiet, washed in yellow light. He thought of his father, not as the man who controlled him, but as the boy Mr. Hoan once must have been, shaped by his own fears and failures. For the first time, anger softened into something more dangerous, understanding. Tu Diep joined him, wrapping a jacket around his shoulders. "You don't have to forgive him tonight," she whispered, "but you don't have to punish yourself either." James closed his eyes. In that moment, he understood that happiness was not waiting at the end of his father's disappearance. It was waiting inside a harder task, learning to release the past without denying it. The silence around them remained, but it no longer screamed. it began, slowly, to listen. Happiness, James finally understood, rarely arrives the way we imagine it. It does not knock loudly, announcing victory over pain. Sometimes it slips in quietly, through a door we never planned to open. The day the police confirmed that Mr. Hoan was alive, but had chosen to disappear on his own, James felt no rush of relief, no surge of triumph. Instead, there was a strange calm, like the stillness after a storm, when the air feels unfamiliar but clean. The man who had once ruled his life with rules and fear was no longer standing in front of him. Yet the shadow he cast had begun to fade, not because it was forced away, but because James had stopped chasing it. Tu Diep watched this change with careful eyes. She saw James laugh more freely, not out of rebellion, but out of ease. One morning, as they walked through the local market, he stopped to help an elderly vendor pick up fallen oranges. It was a small act, ordinary and unnoticed by most, but Tu Diep smiled. Healing, she realized, often hides inside ordinary moments. Life did not suddenly become perfect. There were still bills to pay, worries about the future, and quiet nights when questions returned uninvited. But something fundamental had shifted. James no longer measured his happiness by his father's absence. He measured it by his own choices, by the life he was building with intention rather than defiance. One evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops, Tu Diep asked the question she had been holding back. If your father came back, would that destroy us?
James thought for a long time. Then he shook his head. No, he said softly, because I'm not running anymore. Whether he returns or not, I know where I stand. In that answer, Tu Diep heard the sound of freedom, not the loud, dramatic kind people dream about, but the steady freedom of someone who has learned to stand without permission. She reached for his hand, and he held it, not as a shield against the past, but as a promise to the present. Somewhere out there, Mr. Hoan was living with the weight of his own choices. James no longer needed to carry that burden for him. Love, he realized, does not always mean staying, and family does not always mean obedience. As night settled in, the world continued its familiar rhythm, lights turning off, doors closing, hearts resting. James and Tu Diep walked home together, not because the past had vanished, but because it no longer controlled their direction. And perhaps that was the real answer to the question everyone whispered. Mr. Hoan's disappearance did not make them happy. Choosing themselves did.
This story teaches us that true happiness does not come from someone else's absence or downfall, but from our own growth and choices. Running away from pain may bring temporary relief, yet healing begins only when we face our emotions with honesty and courage. Family love does not mean blind obedience, and respect does not require sacrificing one's own life for happiness. James's journey shows that forgiveness is not about forgetting the past, but about freeing the heart from resentment. When we stop living to please or rebel against others, we begin to live for ourselves. Love, when it is genuine, gives us the strength to stand independently rather than hide behind someone else's shadow. In the end, maturity is learning to take responsibility for our decisions, accept imperfection, and move forward with compassion. Happiness grows quietly in everyday moments when we choose understanding over anger, courage over fear, and self-respect over control.